It began as just another flight, routine, scheduled, and unremarkable. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing. On board were 239 people. Travelers, families, crew. Some were headed home, some toward new beginnings. None of them knew that within hours the flight would vanish from radar, from communication, and eventually from the known world. What followed was not only one of the greatest aviation mysteries in history, but a quiet fracture in our belief that the modern world is too advanced, too connected, too watched to simply lose something so large. Chapter 1: The Day the Sky Went Quiet. On the morning of March 8, 2014, the skies over Southeast Asia were deceptively serene. The light haze of tropical humidity lay thick on the horizon, softening the sun's glare, and air traffic followed its usual rhythm. Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta set records thousands of miles away, but here, over the Malay Peninsula and the Gulf of Thailand, routine reigned. It was in this ordinary stretch of air, just after takeoff, that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, a Boeing 777-200ER, had departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 0:41 local time, bound for Beijing. On board were 239 souls, passengers and crew, each carrying quiet narratives, travelers expecting business meetings, families on holiday, pilots making another routine flight. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, with over 18,000 hours of experience, was at the controls. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid was on his first flight as a 777 co-pilot. They climbed into daylight, hugging waypoints to Iguri, then turning northeast toward Bangkok and on toward Beijing. At 1:07, the aircraft passed over its waypoints, routine acknowledgments exchanged between captain, first officer, and air traffic controllers. The exchange was unremarkable, so ordinary that nobody paid close attention. Routine checklists, standard weather reports, generic ATC instructions. This was an ordinary night flight for a familiar aircraft, a familiar airline, traveling a familiar path. But then at 1:19, communication ceased. The last ADS-B handshake with Malaysian military radar logged a sudden, unexplained turn west. No distress call. No indication of trouble. The pilots said nothing. Yet the airplane's transponders fell silent shortly after the turn. From that point forward, Flight 370 dropped off the map, physically and metaphorically, leaving only absence behind. For a moment, radar blips flickered on military screens in peninsular Malaysia. A new aircraft, heading west instead of northeast, emerged in the data, but without identity. It carried no transponder. It offered no answer. To air traffic control, it didn't exist. To civilian radar, it didn't exist. In the skies overhead, the aircraft, if still flying, was already gone. On the ground, alarms had yet to be raised. Ground controllers noted only the lack of transponder signals, attributed to technical failure. Some watch officers felt a faint urge of unease, but the systems treated Flight 370 as still airborne. In modern aviation, a forgotten transponder is not entirely unprecedented. It can occur when pilots inadvertently disable their systems. The aircraft would still appear on secondary radar, but pilots aren't required to respond in such cases. And none did if the crew was aware at all. But a system-wide response wouldn't begin until those blips vanished completely. The clock ticked toward 2:40 before anyone on the ground noticed. Malaysia's military radar, operating discreetly in a defensive posture, finally questioned the flight's disappearance. The blip that had turned west had gone. At 2:40, gate guard radar seizures triggered an unscheduled review. Radar operators recognized something was amiss. An aircraft vanishing off multiple scopes halfway across Malaysia. And yet there were no reports, no audio transmissions. Flight 370 simply wasn't where it was supposed to be. As minutes stretched into an hour, the haze on the horizon outside KLIA still concealed the truth. Flights came and went, oblivious to the growing mystery. A Boeing 777, billions of dollars of technology, and nearly 200,000 pounds of fuel had become invisible. The silence, once routine, now roared louder than any voice could. Eventually, around 2:15, Malaysian Air Traffic Control declared the flight overdue. A search was organized starting with the South China Sea, under the assumption that the craft had crashed shortly after takeoff. It was the simplest explanation and often the safest in a crisis. If a flight disappears, look around the last known coordinates. Search teams surged into action, deploying ships, aircraft, and analyses from Australia, China, the US, and private firms. They scoured the South China Sea's endless stretch, focusing on currents, debris patterns, and small radar signatures. They summoned fishermen, opened communication channels with oil tankers sailing through the area. But they found nothing. No distress beacon, no floating wreckage, no oil slick. As days turned into weeks, the silence was replaced by nervous voices. Speculation rose. Could this be terrorism? A hostile takeover of the cockpit? A bomb? Plot? Negotiators prepared for possible ransom demands. Families waited, numb with anxiety and uncertainty. Ministers and heads of state began issuing statements. Social media exploded with hashtags, missing images, conspiracy theories, organized skepticism, and cries for action. But still, the aircraft remained silent, invisible, empty, or not. And in that unfilled sky, two questions arose quietly, almost as separate rhythms. What happened? Where is Flight 370? Each question carried its own darkness, the first filled with grief, hypothesis, and terror, the second filled with mystery, measurement, and muted hope. In the days that followed, the initial choice to search the South China Sea was confronted with growing suspicion. The unidentified blip turning west suggested a deliberate diversion. What if the aircraft hadn't crashed offshore but had been guided into a new destination? If turned purposely, why? For what purpose? And where, then? As analysis of radar data, satellite handshake pings, engine performance logs, and flight simulator files progressed, the puzzle gained depth and complexity. Data from Inmarsat, once only used to divine aircraft distress or position via hourly ping logouts, transformed into thread guidance. The so-called Seventh Arcade, the Southern Corridor, the handshake bursts. Pilots plotted points. Computer programmers overlaid satellite footprints. Analysis shifted south, then west. But Flight 370 didn't respond. Months would pass before any physical trace washed ashore. Even then, the possibilities remained ethereal, tattered flapper and fragments, unidentifiable debris, the tears of a distant sea. Some experts leapt toward that evidence. Others said they couldn't confirm cause or origin. Those were the words that haunted families, unidentifiable. Couldn't be confirmed. Possibly linked. Almost certainly. Here, at the intersection of grief and mystery, is the most painful distance of all, the space between what once was and what will never be known. For the passengers and crew, for their families, the rooms they left empty, the meals never cooked, the memories unfinished, there emerged no remains, only absence. But this story is not about debris. It is about presence. About those 239 people and the world that watched them vanish. About what it means when a machine, certified and modern, simply disappears from existence. About how a crisis ignition reverberates through systems, through countries and families, until it becomes a question impossible to resolve and the silence surrounding that question starts to speak. In the coming chapters, we will unfold the voices of the missing, not to speak for them, but to remember them. We will explore those 7 arcs of satellite pings, the fragmented debris that drifted, the theories that heated quietly underground. We will enter the ocean, the seafloor searches, the political backchannels, and the classified files. We will remain calm, descriptive, reflective, never sensational. Each chapter will begin with a moment, a place, or a person and drift slowly into the unknown. Tonight, let your thoughts settle in the empty blue above the seas of Asia. Let the hush of what is no longer there become a meditation on our collective fragility. The sky can hold billions of departures and yet hold silence still. This is the moment Flight 370 left the world. Gently, quietly, without a wake. Chapter 2, Ordinary Passengers, Extraordinary Silence. In the quiet half-light just before dawn on March 8, 2014, passengers arrived at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. They came from cities and villages around the globe, Beijing executives with briefcases, grandparents escorting grandchildren, a family honeymoon bound for Europe, and individuals carrying their own silent stories, hopes, griefs, routines. None of them could have imagined their world was about to be fractured, their journeys forever suspended in time. Flight 370 carried 227 passengers and 12 crew members. They represented 15 nationalities: Malaysians, Chinese, Australians, Americans, Canadians, Russians, New Zealanders, Ukrainians, an Indian diplomat, a Dutch businessman, an Iranian politician, and others. Each carried a ticket that said Kuala Lumpur, Beijing. Each had planned certainty. The two pilots, Captain Zahari and First Officer Farrick, were experienced professionals. Zahari had flown this route many times. He had a flight simulator at home and sketched out flight paths in his spare time. He was thoughtful, admired in his community. Farrick was younger, eager, still enwrapped in the routine of training and checklists. Together, they represented experience and learning, a partnership built for predictability. The night sky awaited them as it does every night. A blanket ready to cradle travelers in wings and lights. Just another routine crossing between nations. Just another flight in the endless machine of modern mobility. On board, cabin crew performed their professional harmony, boarding announcements in Malay, English, and Mandarin, safety demonstrations, adjustments of headsets and magazine pockets. Meals were served. Laughter rose when infants fretted, murmurs filled the aisles, phones were switched to airplane mode. The Boeing 777, spacious and smooth, carried them away. As engines spun up and reversed thrust sent them down runway 32R, nobody could hear the silence growing behind them. At 0:41 local time, the flight released into the night, a string of 239 lives walking onto a living metal structure. To outside observers, it was unremarkable. A standard departure. Yet for one man, the moment was meant to matter most. A family of 3, a father, mother, and young daughter, boarded with soft smiles and bright clothes. They sat in 19A, 19B, 19C. Their business trip was almost over, their return lay moments ahead. They spoke of the weather in Beijing, of new shoes and bedtime stories waiting. A Chinese businessman settled into 13K, adjusting his neck pillow and checking emails. He planned an early meeting. A Malaysian grandmother in 26A adjusted her spectacles and looked forward to seeing her granddaughter wake up on Christmas Day. An American professor carried a briefcase of papers that would never see daylight. In row 40, an Australian family of 4 huddled, anticipating an exotic vacation in Thailand. They shared snacks and stories. In row 47 sat Drive Lu, returning to Beijing after visiting a friend in Kuala Lumpur. His glasses caught the cabin lights as he closed his eyes. The rhythm of flight magic. Near silence, gentle vibration. The world turning below. In the flight deck, Zahari and Farrick reviewed checklist items, monitored engine readings, maintained steady climb. Their voices were calm. Every switch, every gauge was normal. From first officer's chair to cockpit door, the calm often affects everything. At 1:19, 38 minutes after takeoff, the last routine contact occurred. The craft descended toward waypoint Iguri, preparing for handoff to Ho Chi Minh City airspace. The phrase "Good night, Malaysia 370" echoed softly before being absorbed by radios and traffic flow. And then silence. No further communication. No response to radio calls. The transponder buzz abruptly stopped transmitting. The consistent ADS-B signals ceased. To ATC and systems tracking and handling, the flight simply melted away like clouds evaporating over the ocean. In that crack of absence, the passengers still inhaled their last breaths, unaware. Their phones switched to standby. Their thoughts readied, paused, unknowing. For families waiting in Beijing, each minute slid away. They touched their phones, tried calling for arrival updates. They watched airport screens. The screens filled with other flight statuses. Dropbox messages, checking open gates, scanning distances. But MH370 never showed on arrival. The track ended. Their patience ticked forward. In Kuala Lumpur, some crew relatives waited for news. At midnight, they thought of bedtime routines already slipping behind. Phones buzzed with no show. A Delta app pinged, plane delayed. But there was no delay. There was nothing. No trail, no confirmation, nothing. The extraordinary silence filled gaps between conversations. Gaps in time that turned into gaps in maps, locked out of both radar and reality. Those passengers inhabited a place that thought couldn't follow, borders between continents, between living and unspoken, between being alive and leaving no image behind. International investigations began. Kuala Lumpur was first sight. The government convened ministers. The public was informed. An aircraft is missing. Diplomatic protocols launched. Next of kin processed. Grief staff deployed. Police called. Press rooms set. Yet the passengers remained presence in absence. Not declared lost. Not confirmed dead. Their belongings waited at gates. Their documents and luggage tracks unclaimed. Each lost traveler became a ghost across countries, embedded in news headlines, reconstructed in social profiles, birthday well-wishings and missing person photos. Each person started carrying dual identities, living until proven otherwise, then indicated lost. The aviation system buckled. Nothing alive in the air should vanish without wake. Experiments in routes, radar files, signals resumed endlessly. Pilots recognized over water, speed tests in sector corners, flight paths. Nothing aligned. Back on board that night, no one said goodbye. No final words were spoken. Just flight status, on time. Departed. Never seen again. Their absence asked hard questions. If an aircraft can be erased in modern airspace, what does it mean for the systems we rely on? What lies beyond the boundary of visibility and authority? For the families, each hour without news was ache. They described it as the worst kind of waiting, a disappearance without endpoint. In the following weeks, memorial services moved into living rooms and consulates. Candles lit at home altars. Messages reading, "We miss you, daughter. Please come back." The silence of the travelers became a shared burden. Their belongings, spare toothbrushes, phone chargers, passports remained packed, waiting for return that never came. In Beijing, a ceremony at Beijing Daxing Airport illuminated empty seats, empty bins, empty strollers. Staff and volunteers lined condolences and tribute. In Penang and Melbourne, gatherings asked for resolution that never arrived. Meanwhile, the aircraft, whose serial number and build history were public, lay at the center of something else, speculation. The 777 was known for reliability. Its maintenance logs were clean, its systems robust. There had been no reported technical trouble. The passengers were unconnected beyond international travel norms, business travelers, family visits, vacationers. No pattern, no hidden bond, just individuals expecting an arrival. That is what gives this story its melancholy resonance. It wasn't the attack, the military incursion, the hostile takeover. It was simply flight, the familiar moving unnoticed. And when it disappeared, the world asked not who or why, but how and where. In the next chapters, we will follow their echoes, across radar footprints, through radar returns, into the sonar grids of ocean floors, across satellite arcs, into courtrooms and classified archives. But this chapter remains their story, humans whose memories and futures were snatched from them that night, along with an aircraft that was meant to carry them across continents. Now ask, what does existence become when the journey stops? Not with a crash, a wreckage, or a wrecked timeline, but with an unanswered pause. This is their presence. Not in sightings, but in absence. Not in records, but in silence. They were ordinary people. And in each heartbeat of disappearance, they became symbols of how fragile our systems and our humanity really are. Chapter 3, Ground Control, Gone Tracking. At first, no one panicked. In the early morning hours of March 8, 2014, when MH370 failed to make its scheduled check-in with Vietnamese air traffic control at Ho Chi Minh, the assumption was mundane: a missed handoff, a radio misstep, perhaps turbulence causing a temporary blip in transmission. Pilots know this happens. Controllers know this happens. It's a routine hiccup in the web of global aviation. A quiet delay, a watchful moment. But the minutes passed. Then an hour, then more. In Kuala Lumpur's Air Traffic Control Center, routine became discomfort. They called ahead to Ho Chi Minh. "Have you received contact from Malaysian 370? Negative. The silence stretched. To the average passenger, it's easy to imagine the cockpit a place of infallibility, a fortress of radar, satellite communications, and unwavering oversight. But the reality is subtler. Over oceans and remote parts of the world, commercial aircraft briefly slip through seams in coverage. Radar systems are limited to land and coastal areas. VHF radio transmissions can fade. In these gaps, aircraft must rely on protocol, planning, and digital pings. At 2:40 a.m., 3 hours after takeoff, flight MH370 should have been over the South China Sea, steadily nearing Vietnamese airspace. But radar signatures had vanished near a waypoint named Igari, a navigational mark southeast of Vietnam. There, the plane appeared to blink off civil radar. Its transponder, identifying the aircraft to radar screens, had stopped transmitting. Aviation officials, still resisting alarm, initiated a phone chain, calls to pilots on nearby flights. No one had heard from MH370. No sightings. No chatter on emergency frequencies. Nothing. By 5:30 a.m., the reality hardened. The aircraft was overdue. It had missed scheduled handoffs, ignored protocol, bypassed checkpoints in the sky. A Boeing 777 with 239 souls on board had become, inexplicably, silent. Malaysia Airlines, initially cautious, issued a public statement. Flight MH370 is missing. We are working with the authorities who have activated their search and rescue teams. The phrase search and rescue rang out through satellite channels and across news wires, waking journalists in Beijing, Washington, and Canberra. Within hours, headlines blared across digital front pages: Malaysian plane disappears from radar. But where had it gone? The first theory was crash. A mid-air explosion, a failure, a descent into ocean waters. The South China Sea was scanned, first by Malaysian vessels, then by Vietnamese patrol boats, then by a coalition of maritime and military units from 10 nations. Hundreds of square miles were canvassed by helicopters and spotter planes. Nothing. Not a single piece of floating debris. No oil slick. No distress signal. No emergency beacon. The Boeing 777, a marvel of aviation engineering, had vanished without so much as a floating cushion or flashing signal. Then came the twist. On March 11th, 3 days after disappearance, Malaysian military radar analysts reviewed raw data. Hidden within the haze of their systems was something extraordinary: a primary radar return showing a large, fast-moving aircraft making an abrupt left turn back across the Malay Peninsula. MH370 hadn't plunged into the South China Sea. It had turned. It had crossed back over Malaysia. And it had flown for over an hour more, unspeaking, unidentified, ghosting its way northwest toward the Andaman Sea. This wasn't a plane in distress. This was a plane deliberately flying. Civil radar had lost the aircraft near Igari. But military radar, a separate system designed for defense, had continued tracking an object, most likely MH370, flying low and west, off normal routes until contact was lost near a spot called Mekar in the Strait of Malacca. This revelation turned everything on its head. What kind of mechanical failure causes a plane to reverse course, cross multiple flight zones, and continue flying silently for over an hour? Who was in control? The questions now took on new gravity, and intelligence agencies began paying closer attention. The FBI joined the investigation. China's Ministry of State Security grew involved. Australia, which managed significant radar and search operations in the region, pledged full resources. Aircraft logs were reanalyzed. Pilot histories were scrutinized. Theories, once tentative, began to emerge. Some believed in catastrophic failure, followed by autopilot and a slow, ghost flight. Others whispered darker possibilities: hijack, sabotage, or rogue flight operation. The digital age fueled speculation. But amid this chaos, a single clue emerged that would transform the search entirely: a whisper from 22,000 miles above Earth. At Inmarsat, a British satellite telecommunications company, engineers quietly reviewed routine data logs. Commercial airliners regularly communicate with geostationary satellites for simple maintenance exchanges, a kind of automatic handshake between aircraft and spaceborne systems. These signals do not carry position data, only evidence that an aircraft terminal is active. MH370 had been communicating silently with Inmarsat for hours after it vanished from radar. At 8:11 a.m., 7 hours after takeoff, MH370's satellite communication system sent its last handshake. The aircraft, long past its destination, had still been aloft. Silent. Flying. Somewhere. Based on signal timings and Doppler shifts, Inmarsat analysts did something remarkable. They created 2 arcs of possible positions for the plane at 8:11 a.m., a northern arc stretching across Central Asia, and a southern arc extending deep into the remote southern Indian Ocean. With further analysis, they determined the northern route would have required overflights of multiple heavily monitored airspaces: China, India, Kazakhstan, without detection. Unlikely. The southern path, however, offered something else: desolation. Vast stretches of unpatrolled ocean with no radar coverage and little traffic. A place where a plane could vanish. The conclusion was chilling. MH370 had most likely ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean, far from land, far from any beacon, far from hope. This changed everything. On March 24th, Malaysia's Prime Minister stood before the nation and said solemnly, "Based on new analysis, it is with deep sadness and regret that I must inform you that, according to this new data, flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean. Families collapsed. Protests erupted in Beijing. Hope that had lived in silence. Hope that passengers were being held. Hope of a safe landing on some unknown island was extinguished." And yet, even in the face of this announcement, a haunting reality remained. There was still no wreckage, no fuselage, no black box, no physical proof, only signals. The investigation shifted from an aerial search in the South China Sea to a deep ocean hunt thousands of miles west of Perth, Australia. Oceanographers, sonar experts, and deep-sea vessels would take the lead. The area, remote and vast, was known for rough weather and crushing depths. It would take years. Back in Kuala Lumpur, frustration mounted. How could an international jetliner, with modern transponders and fail-safes, simply vanish for hours with no one noticing? Where were the redundancies? The pings? The alerts? But perhaps more unnerving was the deeper implication. Someone had known how to make it vanish. Someone had known the gaps. And if they had known once, they might know again. In the next chapter, we will descend into the search effort that followed. A massive operation across the ocean floor, scanning silt and silence for any trace of wreckage. The people involved. The politics. The failures. And the strange pieces of wreckage that would finally surface thousands of miles from where they were expected. Let yourself drift for now through radio static and radar blips, through silence and unseen turns. Because what we're chasing now is a trail that was never meant to be found. Chapter 4, Echoes in the Ocean. The southern Indian Ocean is not a place people think about often. It's a vast, uninhabited expanse stretched between Western Australia and Antarctica, full of turbulent weather, towering waves, and an ocean floor that falls deeper than Everest is tall. For centuries, sailors avoided its heart, and even in the modern age, few commercial ships chart its middle. It is not a place designed for search. It is a place where things go to be forgotten. And yet, it was here that flight MH370 had been silently tracked by a whisper of data, its final electronic heartbeat captured by satellite at 8:11 a.m. on March 8, 2014. With this as their starting point, investigators faced an impossible task: locate an aircraft with no confirmed crash site, no floating debris, and no distress signal in a patch of sea larger than the size of the United Kingdom. This became the largest search operation in aviation history. Australia took the lead, supported by Malaysia and China, and soon multiple nations contributed assets. The early days involved visual scans by aircraft, flying grid patterns over rough waters, hoping to spot something: an oil slick, a seat cushion, the shadow of a fuselage beneath the surface. But week after week, nothing appeared. It was as if the aircraft had landed in liquid glass and disappeared without a trace. That's when the search changed from the sky to the deep. Beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean, the seafloor was mapped in high resolution for the first time. This alone was a monumental undertaking. The bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor, was almost entirely uncharted in this region. Deep ravines, undersea volcanoes, and cliffs emerged in sonar. It was a hidden world few had ever seen. To search these depths, investigators turned to autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, robotic submarines equipped with side-scan sonar and high-definition cameras. They swept through the darkness in silence, combing kilometer after kilometer in methodical lines. It was a slow, agonizing process. Each day returned terabytes of data, most of it empty. The original search area was based on the Inmarsat arc and complex modeling of the aircraft's last signals, calculations that considered speed, altitude, fuel consumption, and the peculiarities of satellite frequency shifts. But these calculations, though scientific, were still estimates. A shift of just 100 kilometers could mean miles of missed ocean floor. And the ocean didn't care about human urgency. It moved at its own rhythm. As the months turned into a year, the world's attention began to fade. The media moved on. The headlines shrank. Families, left without closure, struggled to hold onto hope. Some clung to theories, hijacking, remote control, secret landings. Others faced the cold truth that perhaps no answers would come. But then, in July 2015, 504 days after the disappearance, something surfaced. On the shore of Réunion Island, a small French territory in the Indian Ocean, a local man walking along the beach discovered a strange piece of metal, weathered, covered in barnacles, but unmistakably part of an aircraft. Investigators soon confirmed it. The object was a flaperon, part of the right wing of a Boeing 777. It was the first physical evidence from MH370. The flaperon had traveled thousands of kilometers, carried by currents and winds. Its location suggested a southern crash zone, reinforcing the theory that the plane had gone down west of Australia. The ocean, vast and slow, had delivered a single clue. Hope reignited. If one piece had arrived, more could follow. Indeed, over the next 2 years, other fragments began to appear. A piece of engine cowling in Mozambique, an interior panel in Mauritius, a part of the horizontal stabilizer on Madagascar's coast. Each item was examined, cross-referenced with airline maintenance records, and verified. Most were confirmed as highly likely from MH370. But none offered the full picture. They were fragments, not answers. And none told what mattered most: why. Back in Australia, the underwater search pushed forward. The scanning area shifted, refined by new drift analysis and recalculated satellite data. By early 2017, over 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor had been searched, an area larger than South Korea. Still, the wreckage eluded them. On January 17, 2017, the official search was suspended. Despite every effort using the best science available, the statement read, "We have been unable to locate the aircraft." It was not a defeat, the authorities insisted. It was a pause. But for many, it felt like a final silence. To some, the failure to locate the wreckage deepened the mystery. How could an aircraft the size of a 777, with all our modern tracking and technology, disappear so completely? Why had it turned around? Why no mayday? Why no ransom demand, no credible terrorist claim, no electronic trail? Was it a suicide? A hijack? A remote intervention? Or something stranger? The southern Indian Ocean, once invisible to the world, had become a stage for human obsession. The families of the lost refused to let go. Independent researchers built models, combed over sonar data, published papers. Volunteers scanned satellite imagery for debris. A second search, led by the private company Ocean Infinity, launched in 2018 with advanced AUVs, but again it came back empty. Some began to question the data. What if the Inmarsat pings had been wrong? What if the aircraft had gone north after all? Could someone have spoofed signals? Was the arc a deliberate red herring? Others pointed to the flaperon. Why was it still buoyant? Why had so few other parts appeared? If the aircraft had shattered on impact, why were the pieces so limited, so few? And then there were the darker ideas. Theories of military interception, of black ops and advanced technologies. Some whispered that the plane had been taken to Diego Garcia to Kazakhstan to a secret airstrip. Others pointed to passengers with suspicious backgrounds, or cargo listed as electronics, vague enough to mean anything. None of it could be proved. None of it could be dismissed entirely. What was left, in the end, was a plane that had vanished in the age of the satellite, in defiance of every protocol, every system, every safeguard we thought we had. A mystery not in the 1930s, but in 2014. A modern ghost. And still, the ocean held its secret. But perhaps most haunting of all was the feeling that someone, somewhere, might know. That behind the silence and driftwood, a truth existed, buried not in sand, but in decisions, in intentions. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the human side, the crew, the passengers, and the lives left suspended. Who was on board that night? What were their stories? And what could we learn, not from data or sonar, but from the people who vanished when MH370 disappeared into the sky? Let your mind float now along the currents, among the sonar echoes. The sea may be silent, but it remembers. Chapter 5, Passengers of the Vanished. At first glance, the list of names seemed unremarkable, rows of ordinary lives marked by seat numbers and nationalities. But as the hours passed after MH370's disappearance, those names transformed. They became headlines, heartbreaks, questions. Not just a manifest, but a mosaic of 239 human stories, each abruptly cut short somewhere between sky and sea. There were children, couples, business travelers, students, engineers, artists, pilots, parents, people headed home and others on journeys that would never be completed. Together, they formed a diverse portrait of modern global travel, a flight that connected continents, languages, and hopes. But who were they, really? Of the 239 people on board, 227 were passengers. The rest were crew. Among the passengers, the largest group, 152, were Chinese nationals. There were also 38 Malaysians, 7 Indonesians, 6 Australians, 5 Indians, 4 French citizens, 3 Americans, 2 each from Ukraine, Canada, New Zealand, and 1 each from Russia, the Netherlands, and Iran. Many were families returning from holidays or visits abroad. Some were seasoned travelers, others flying for the very first time. They had packed their bags, kissed loved ones goodbye, checked their boarding passes, and stepped into an airport like millions do each day. None expected to become part of history's most enduring aviation mystery. In the days following the disappearance, reporters began to dig. Not for scandal, but for stories, trying to piece together who these people were, in the hope that understanding their lives might offer some meaning to their loss. There was Mohammed Khairul Amri Selamat, a Malaysian aircraft engineer traveling to Beijing for work. Some speculated that his professional background made him a person of interest. He knew how aircraft operated. He knew the systems. Then there were the 2 Iranian men, Puria Nur Muhammad Murdad and Delavar Syed Muhammad Reza, traveling on stolen passports. Early reports raised fears of terrorism. But as days passed, the truth emerged. They were asylum seekers, attempting to start new lives in Europe. There was no evidence they were involved in anything more than escaping difficult circumstances. Zahari Ahmad Shah, the flight's captain, became a figure of both sympathy and suspicion. A 53-year-old veteran with over 18,000 hours of flying experience, Zahari was respected, charismatic, and deeply passionate about aviation. He had a home flight simulator, which investigators seized and studied. They discovered a flight path similar to MH370's final route, something that raised eyebrows but could also be explained as a simulation enthusiast testing various scenarios. He left no note, no known grievance, no evidence of instability. His co-pilot, Farik Abdul Hamid, was 27 on his final training flight before full qualification. Calm, focused, and from a well-regarded family, Farik had once been featured in a television segment about aspiring pilots. He had just started his life in the sky. In business class sat a group of executives from a Chinese telecommunications firm returning from a conference. In economy, a Malaysian couple traveling to visit their daughter, a young Australian family returning from vacation, and students heading back to their universities. Among them was Lu Hong, a Chinese calligrapher whose wife would spend the next year writing poetry to him in his absence. There was Ju Kuan, a martial arts choreographer who had worked on blockbuster films. He had just wrapped up work on The Grandmaster and was scheduled to begin a project with Netflix. Their stories, once lost in anonymity, began to resurface as the world tried to humanize the statistics. The families left behind faced a grief uniquely cruel. There were no funerals, no bodies, no final goodbyes. Just a long, echoing silence punctuated by vague updates and theories. Grief turned to protest. In Beijing, relatives held signs demanding answers. In Kuala Lumpur, they waited in hotels for news that never came. Days stretched into weeks. Hope became exhaustion. Some clung to the idea that the passengers were still alive, that the plane had landed somewhere, and that their loved ones were being held. That one day, the door would open and they'd walk back in. Others slowly accepted the unthinkable, that they were gone somewhere in the blackness of ocean depths no one could reach. The psychological toll was immense. Several relatives developed health issues. Marriages fractured under the weight of ambiguous loss. Children waited for parents who would not return. Still, they organized. They formed support groups. They filed lawsuits. They became activists not just for answers, but for aviation reform, transparency, and the dignity of those who had been lost without a trace. Flight MH370 didn't just disappear. It took with it 239 uniquely shaped lives and left behind a trail of invisible grief spanning continents and years. And yet, as investigators combed through passenger backgrounds, another layer of questions began to form, not about individuals, but about coincidences. A few passengers had connections to sensitive industries. For engineers aboard worked for a semiconductor company, sparking online rumors. A few carried diplomatic passports. Others were linked, though loosely, to geopolitical events. As the mystery deepened, so too did speculation. Could this really have been a coincidence? Could this flight have been deliberately chosen? And if so, by whom? The official investigation ruled out terrorism. There was no credible claim, no ransom demand, no political statement, but in the background, intelligence agencies weren't so quick to dismiss all possibilities. Surveillance footage from the airport was analyzed for signs of suspicious behavior. Nothing concrete emerged. In time, what remained were the families, still waiting, still hoping, and still caught between closure and mystery. Every time a new piece of debris was found, it reawakened the pain. Was this part from near their loved one's seat? Was this the wing they had seen through the window? Was this the end? But debris alone could not tell the story. It lacked the voices of those aboard. And perhaps that's what haunts most of all, not knowing what happened in the final minutes. Whether there was panic, whether there was calm, whether the end came swiftly or slowly, whether the passengers were aware or still hopeful. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, if ever found, may offer those final moments. But until then, we are left with speculation and with memory. In the next chapter, we'll shift to the cockpit and the decisions made or not made during those critical early moments. What do we know about the flight systems? How might someone take control of a plane like this and disappear into the sky? And most hauntingly, was it planned? Let your thoughts settle now. Imagine the quiet of a cabin at night, the gentle hum of engines, the low glow of reading lights, and somewhere ahead, a future that never arrived. Chapter 6, The Switch to Silence. The cockpit of a Boeing 777 is not a place where chaos reigns. It is built for calm, for procedure, for control. Every button, every checklist, every handoff between air traffic control and crew is a small step in a system designed to keep human error at bay. On March 8, 2014, as Flight MH370 pushed back from the gate in Kuala Lumpur, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The weather was fair, the crew well-trained. The aircraft itself, 9 years old, was in good mechanical condition. From all observable angles, the flight began like any other. But 40 minutes into the journey, something changed. There was no radio distress call, no system alert, no squawk code indicating emergency. Just a quiet flick of absence. MH370 disappeared from civilian radar at 1:21 a.m. Malaysian time, just as it was leaving Malaysian airspace and preparing to enter Vietnamese control. It was a moment between worlds, one controller signing off, another about to take over. In aviation, this is standard. One ATC says goodbye, the next says hello. The plane is supposed to continue along its route, calmly handing over responsibility from one authority to the next. But this time, the handoff never happened. The last words heard from the cockpit came at 1:19 a.m. Good night, Malaysian 370, spoken by First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid. The tone was calm, procedural. It did not sound like a man under duress. Then nothing. No greeting to Vietnam. No transponder signal. No acknowledgement. Just silence. A minute later, the plane's transponder, which broadcasts identification and altitude to radar, stopped transmitting. Not failed. Not lost signal. Stopped. The aircraft continued flying, but now it was a ghost, visible only to primary radar, and even then, only barely. This was not a technical error. Disabling the transponder on a Boeing 777 requires deliberate action. It is not a button one bumps accidentally. It requires knowledge, access, and intent. And whoever did it knew that the timing was perfect, just as one controller let go and another had not yet taken charge. Then came the turn. At 1:30 a.m., Malaysian military radar showed something remarkable. The aircraft, now dark to civilian eyes, had banked sharply to the left. It had reversed course, flying west back over the Malay Peninsula. It crossed back over the coastline and into the Strait of Malacca. Then it turned again, this time toward the northwest, passing close to Penang Island. This was not a meandering drift. It was controlled. Purposeful. In the sky, MH370 flew like a pilot still at the helm. But on the ground, no one could raise them. No one knew where it had gone, and no one understood why. Investigators later reconstructed this sequence with a combination of radar returns and satellite data, but at the time there was only confusion. Vietnam waited for a check-in that never came. Kuala Lumpur assumed Vietnam was in control. It took hours before anyone realized the plane was missing valuable hours when it was still in the air. One theory began to form. The aircraft had been deliberately taken. If someone in the cockpit, Captain Zahari or First Officer Farrick, had decided to disappear the plane, this would be how they do it. Wait for the handoff. Turn off communications. Redirect course. Fly where radar coverage was weak. But why? Was it a hijacking? A suicide? A protest? A plan gone wrong? Captain Zahari's life was scrutinized in microscopic detail. He was politically outspoken. He was said to be troubled by national events. Some claimed he was emotionally isolated. His home flight simulator showed he'd practiced flights into the southern Indian Ocean. But for every suggestion of motive, there was a counterweight. No suicide note, no known grievances, no financial distress, no history of erratic behavior. His family insisted he was devoted, kind, stable. The co-pilot, Farrick, had an even cleaner profile, young, optimistic, recently engaged, with no reason to suspect foul play. If this was a deliberate act, it was planned with chilling precision. But what if it wasn't? Could a technical failure explain the loss of communications? Could a fire or a slow decompression render the crew unconscious while the plane continued on autopilot? This became another working theory, a hypoxia event. That's something perhaps a fire in the avionics bay or a fault in cabin pressurization knocked out communication systems and incapacitated the crew. The aircraft, still on autopilot, then followed a pre-programmed path until it ran out of fuel. But this clashed with the initial turns. Those early maneuvers required human control. They were too complex, too timely, too precise. The idea of a slow-drifting aircraft only made sense after that westward turn. Something or someone had changed the plane's course. A third possibility emerged. An intruder. Could someone have taken over the aircraft from outside the cockpit? Could a passenger have forced their way in? This seemed unlikely. The cockpit door was reinforced, secure, and locked from the inside. And after September 11th, procedures for cockpit security were extremely strict. Yet some theorized that a hijacker could have smuggled a device aboard, or perhaps hacked into the aircraft's systems through the entertainment network. Though experts dismissed this as science fiction, the idea stuck in the public mind. Others whispered of remote control, military-grade systems capable of overriding onboard controls. If MH370 carried something or someone of great interest, could it have been redirected remotely? There was no evidence, just speculation. And still, the sequence was haunting. First, communications silenced. Then, a controlled turn. Then, hours of flight across remote stretches of ocean, followed by a presumed descent into one of the world's most isolated patches of sea. This was not a crash of panic. It was an erasure. One final possibility emerged, something harder to prove but quietly considered, that this act, whatever it was, had a message. That it was a statement, but one meant for a very specific audience. A demonstration of vulnerability in systems we trust. A message that no one else was meant to hear. But that too was just a theory. What remained were questions. Why was there no distress call? Why didn't someone try to break into the cockpit if something went wrong? If it was a suicide, why take 238 others? If it was a hijacking, why make no demands? And if it was an accident, how could it create such perfect silence? In the next chapter, we'll trace the satellite data, the so-called handshakes, and examine how a handful of signals became the foundation of an entire theory of disappearance. These were the only clues that led the search to the Southern Ocean. But how reliable were they? And what did they really tell us? Let your thoughts rest now. Imagine the cockpit, quiet and dark. The glow of instruments. The night sky ahead. A decision made, or perhaps a moment lost, that would echo for years. Chapter 7: The Digital Trail. In a world governed by technology, disappearing without a trace is almost unthinkable. Planes are tracked. Phones leave digital footprints. Satellites sweep the globe. And yet, flight MH370 evaded them all until a single strand of data, almost overlooked, changed everything. This data didn't come from radar. It didn't come from voice recordings or cameras or eyewitnesses. It came from the sky, from a British company few had ever heard of before, Inmarsat. Headquartered in London, Inmarsat operates a global satellite communications network. Airlines use their system to provide in-flight internet, monitor aircraft health, and maintain connections with ground teams. Flight MH370 had one of these systems on board. And though its transponder and ACARS communications were silent, something else kept whispering. It was called a handshake. Roughly every hour, the aircraft's onboard satellite system sent out a small signal, a digital ping, a check-in to confirm it was still connected to the network. Normally, this goes unnoticed. It's routine, like a heartbeat in a sleeping body. But after all other signals were lost, these handshakes remained. There were 7 of them. The first occurred at 2:25 a.m., about an hour after MH370 disappeared from radar. And then another and another over the next 6 hours. Each ping confirmed one chilling truth. The plane was still in the air. But they did not say where. Unlike GPS, these handshakes didn't give a precise location. Instead, they gave something subtler, a time delay. The longer the signal took to reach the satellite, the farther away the aircraft was. Using these delays, Inmarsat's engineers began to draw arcs, curved paths where the plane could have been when it sent each ping. 7 pings. 7 arcs. A ghostly trail across the sky. Then, using Doppler shift, the change in frequency caused by the motion of the aircraft, they estimated the direction the plane was traveling. After weeks of calculation and confirmation, they identified 2 possible corridors where MH370 might have flown after it turned off course. One path curved north over Central Asia. The other stretched south into the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. The northern route led over highly militarized regions: China, Pakistan, India. No radar systems in those countries had seen MH370. No evidence supported that path. It would have been nearly impossible for the plane to fly there undetected. So investigators focused on the southern route. It was a place no one had searched before. An expanse of open ocean, wild and remote, where few ships traveled and no radar reached. This wasn't a detour. It was a descent into isolation. And then came the final ping. At 8:19 a.m., 7 hours and 38 minutes after takeoff, the system sent one last burst. After that, silence. Experts believed this final handshake indicated power loss. Possibly it was the moment the engines flamed out due to fuel exhaustion. Shortly after, the plane likely began its descent into the sea. There was no distress call. No automated system triggered. Just that last quiet signal, like a curtain drawing closed. And yet, this digital trail became the foundation of the search. Using the last known arc, analysts tried to estimate where the plane would have gone next, factoring in fuel load, speed, possible autopilot behavior, and even the curvature of the Earth. The result was the 7th arc, a narrow band across the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers west of Australia. It was here, they believed, that MH370 had gone down. Search ships were deployed. Australia led the operation, joined by experts from around the world. They used sonar, underwater drones, and towed systems scanning the seabed for debris or wreckage. The search became the largest in aviation history, spanning months, then years. But the ocean held its secret. For over 2 years, not a single piece of MH370 was found. The water was deep, up to 6,000 meters in some places. The terrain was mountainous, filled with canyons and ridges. And the search area was enormous, stretching across tens of thousands of square kilometers. Then, in July 2015, a discovery. On Réunion Island, east of Madagascar, a piece of aircraft debris washed ashore. It was a flaperon, part of a wing, confirmed to be from a Boeing 777. Experts matched serial numbers and paint patterns. It was from MH370. The trail, once invisible, had reappeared. Over the following months, more debris surfaced. On beaches in Mozambique, Mauritius, Tanzania. all scattered along ocean currents that flowed from the seventh arc. Most were small parts of the interior, wing fragments, engine panels. None provided conclusive answers about the crash itself. But they confirmed this much: the plane had indeed gone south. The discovery of debris both energized and frustrated the investigation. It proved they were looking in the right place, but it also raised haunting questions. If the aircraft had broken up on impact, why hadn't more wreckage floated sooner? If it had glided before crashing, where was the fuselage? Why hadn't the black boxes been found? The Inmarsat data became both savior and curse. It was the only real clue, but it also had limitations. It didn't pinpoint a crash site. It didn't explain what happened on board. It only showed a trajectory, a digital echo of a plane flying into oblivion. Critics questioned the data's reliability. Could the system have malfunctioned? Could someone have spoofed the signal? Might the plane have taken a different path entirely? The investigation remained firm. The data was sound. Independent analyses confirmed the math. The pings were real. The seventh arc was correct. But time was running out. By 2018, the official search was called off after covering more than 120,000 square kilometers. Private companies launched smaller efforts. Ocean Infinity, using cutting-edge underwater drones, searched additional areas but found nothing. The digital trail had ended. The rest was ocean. And so the story of MH370 became one of fragments, both literal and symbolic. Pieces of plane scattered across continents. Data points floating in the ether. And human grief, tethered to a mystery that resisted even the most advanced technology. In the next chapter, we'll explore alternative theories. What if the official path was wrong? What if the plane didn't crash but landed? What if the signals were manipulated or the data misunderstood? Close your eyes now. Picture the open ocean, the silence of satellites listening to nothing, and a final digital whisper fading into the sky. Chapter 8. Shadows and Doubt. By the time MH370 had been missing for more than a year, the world had started to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Official statements still came, though less frequently. Families still gathered, quietly demanding answers. And the world, always ready to move on, began to turn its gaze elsewhere. But beneath the surface, doubt had begun to take root. It wasn't about grief anymore, or even hope. It was about the shadows, the growing gaps in the story that couldn't quite be explained. The inconsistencies, the silences, the things that didn't add up. When a modern jetliner disappears, the world expects a clear, technological resolution. MH370 defied that expectation. It was too complete a vanishing, too quiet, too deliberate. And so, inevitably, came the theories. Some clung to the official account, a tragic accident. A slow drift south after a technical failure or incapacitation ending in the Indian Ocean. Clean, clinical, and mathematically grounded. But others began to wonder, what if the official story was not wrong but incomplete? The first category of doubts centered on the Inmarsat data, the 7 handshakes. While experts validated the signals and confirmed the path, critics questioned the assumptions underneath. Could the Doppler effect have been miscalculated? Could the system have been tampered with? Some technologists suggested the pings might have been spoofed, imitated, or redirected to give the illusion of a southern path when the plane had gone elsewhere. It seemed far-fetched, but so did the disappearance itself. Then came a more provocative question: what if MH370 didn't crash at all? A few theorists argued the plane may have landed on a remote airstrip, perhaps in a part of the world where radar coverage was minimal and prying eyes were few. These theories pointed to abandoned military runways in Central Asia or the Australian outback, or to islands in the Indian Ocean with limited surveillance. It would have required planning, resources, complicity. But if someone wanted the plane hidden, not destroyed, it wasn't beyond imagination. What could be gained by such an act? That depended on what was on board. Some theories focused on passengers. MH370 carried 239 people from 14 countries, including engineers, defense contractors, and scientists. Among them were employees of Freescale Semiconductor, a company involved in advanced electronics, including military applications. Some believed someone wanted them and their work taken. That this wasn't about terrorism but acquisition, a quiet removal far from headlines. Then there was the cargo. The plane was carrying nearly 5 tons of mangosteens, a tropical fruit, alongside nearly 200 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries. On the surface, nothing unusual. But lithium batteries, if improperly stored, can overheat, burn, even explode. Could a hidden fire have knocked out communication systems, incapacitated the crew, and caused a slow drift into the ocean? Perhaps. But even then, how did it begin right at the point of a handoff between airspaces? Timing remained the most suspicious detail in every theory. At 1:21 a.m., the plane's transponder was disabled. It was a precise moment, between the goodbye to Malaysian controllers and the expected hello to Vietnamese ATC. It was a gap, routine but vulnerable. Whoever acted at that moment knew exactly what they were doing. Too many things had to go exactly right or wrong for it to be coincidence. So the narrative deepened. Some wondered whether someone on board had planned it, that perhaps Captain Zahari, or someone impersonating him, had orchestrated a disappearance for reasons unknown. The captain's home simulator came under scrutiny. Among the saved routes was a path into the southern Indian Ocean eerily similar to the suspected crash zone. But experts were divided. Pilots often simulate unusual flights. It didn't prove intent. Still, the idea persisted. Was Zahari quietly saying goodbye? Those close to him rejected the idea completely. He was stable, passionate about flying, devoted to family. Others weren't so sure. He had recently faced political disillusionment, personal isolation. Could it have been a protest? A statement against something he couldn't change? Even that theory faltered against one central fact. 238 other souls were on board. If MH370 was a suicide, why make it a mass death? Unless he intended to disappear the plane, not destroy it. Another theory suggested a hijacking, but not the kind we knew from the past. This one, perhaps, was surgical, unseen, executed by someone with deep knowledge of systems, patterns, blind spots. Not a political hijacking, but a strategic one. Some asked, could a foreign intelligence agency have taken the plane? The logic was murky. Why take it? Where would it go? What was the end game? And most of all, how had they kept it secret? Then, more darkly, came suggestions that the plane had not disappeared entirely by mistake. That its path had been known to some and the truth buried. That authorities had more data than they shared. That the long delay in initiating a full search was not due to confusion, but choice. Malaysia's government, already facing political pressure, released information in stages. Early radar returns were inconsistent. Transcripts were delayed. The public timeline changed more than once. Some believed this was incompetence. Others saw something more deliberate. Could knowledge of the plane's path, its turn back across Malaysia, for instance, have been known earlier? And if so, why wasn't the search redirected sooner? There were no clear answers. Just growing suspicion. When debris began to wash ashore, the silence grew heavier. Pieces of plane confirmed a southern path, but not how or why it happened. Each fragment raised more questions. Where was the fuselage? The cockpit? The black boxes? And more than that, why so little? The Indian Ocean is a powerful body, but many expected more wreckage. More floating seats, clothing, human remains. Instead, what washed ashore were mostly unidentifiable parts. Items detached, battered, carried thousands of kilometers. Some pointed out the implications. A hard crash would scatter debris. A soft descent might keep it intact. If the plane glided to a stop, someone may have been conscious at the end. Someone may have been flying it. And if so, why? These shadows remained. Doubts woven through facts. Theories balanced between grief and imagination. The families, more than anyone, carried this weight. They asked what happened in the final minutes. Whether their loved ones suffered. Whether there was time to pray. Whether someone, somewhere, still knew more. But the official investigation stayed its course. It maintained the Inmarsat data, the seventh arc, the Southern Ocean. It acknowledged that deliberate action was likely but not confirmed. It admitted it might never know. In the end, all the theories existed side by side, none fully proven, none entirely dismissed. And the world waited. In the next chapter, we'll look at the people left behind, the families, the investigators, the search teams, and how they carried the burden of silence. The human cost of a mystery still unsolved. Because MH370 was not just a puzzle. It was a tragedy. Let your thoughts drift now. past the theories, past the timelines, just into the quiet, into the long echo of questions that remain unanswered. Chapter 9. The Living Silence. In the months after MH370 vanished, the world returned to its routines. Planes continued to take off. Airlines restructured their safety protocols. New headlines appeared. Wars, elections, crises, life moved forward. But for 239 families, time did not move. It stalled. It folded into itself. There was no grave to visit. No final words. No closure. Just silence. For the families of the passengers and crew, the disappearance was not just a news event, it was a fracture in reality. They had lived through the worst thing imaginable, and yet, there was nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no clear truth. Just that their loved ones had boarded a plane and then had been lost to the sky. In Kuala Lumpur, in Beijing, in cities and towns across the world, that loss became something heavier than grief. It was absence, ongoing, hollow, without form or end. Many families found themselves in limbo, not knowing whether to mourn or wait. Some couldn't bring themselves to touch the untouched rooms, the unwashed clothing, the unopened letters. Others kept calling the missing phones, if only to hear their voices one more time. Birthdays came. Anniversaries passed. Holidays arrived with an empty chair at the table. There were vigils, quiet ceremonies, candlelight reflections. In China especially, where most of the passengers were from, family members gathered regularly outside airline offices and government buildings, holding photos, signs, sometimes just standing in silence. They wanted answers. Not theories, not condolences. Truth. But truth remained elusive. The Malaysian government made statements. Investigators released updates. Experts debated theories. And yet, nothing filled the void. Each revelation raised more questions. Each delay deepened distrust. Some families began to wonder, not just what had happened, but whether they were being told the whole story. In Beijing, relatives formed support groups. Some turned to each other, becoming a kind of family themselves, bound not by blood, but by a shared tragedy. Others withdrew, unable to bear the weight of uncertainty. For the crew families, there was another layer of sorrow. Flight attendants, pilots, engineers, these were trained professionals. People who had spent years in the air, who understood the risks, who believed in the systems. To lose them without cause, without narrative, was to lose not just people, but a kind of trust. Some relatives refused to believe the plane had crashed. They clung to other ideas, government conspiracies, military cover-ups, hidden landings. Not because they rejected reason, but because reason had offered them so little. In moments of desperation, even the improbable can feel like hope. Meanwhile, the investigators continued their work. In Australia, the Joint Agency Coordination Center led the search. Engineers, analysts, oceanographers, all united in the largest, most complex underwater search ever attempted. They mapped the seabed with sonar, towed instruments thousands of meters deep, scanned for any sign of wreckage. But they found nothing. The ocean is vast. It is opaque. It does not give up its secrets easily. And with each passing week, the likelihood of finding the plane grew smaller. Ocean currents shifted. Debris patterns changed. Batteries on black boxes faded into silence. For those who searched, it was a burden as well. Crews spent months at sea, working in 12-hour shifts, watching screens for anomalies. Engineers reviewed thousands of sonar images. Experts debated every signal, every shadow. There were moments of hope, blips that could be wreckage. But always they turned out to be natural formations, discarded containers, or false echoes. Still, the searchers persisted, because they knew what was at stake. And then, in 2015, when the first piece of debris washed ashore on Réunion Island, hope surged. Finally, something tangible. The flaperon, part of the wing, was confirmed to be from MH370. For many families, it was the first real proof that the plane had ended in the ocean. But for others, it changed nothing. A single part, thousands of kilometers away, explained little. It did not answer how the plane had vanished or why no larger wreckage had been found. In some ways, the debris complicated things. It raised questions about currents, impact, and the possibility of a controlled descent. If the plane had crashed at high speed, why were some parts so intact? Was someone flying it until the very end? Again, speculation rose. Again, answers did not. And so the living silence continued. In time, some families chose to accept what little the world could offer. They held memorials, planted trees, let go in their own private ways. Others never stopped searching. They followed every lead, read every update. Some launched independent investigations, hired private experts, even tried to raise funds for new searches. Because to stop searching would be to admit something they couldn't bear. That the world could lose 239 people without explanation, and then simply forget. In 2018, after 4 years, the official search was suspended. The final report admitted what many feared: it was unlikely the full truth would ever be known. For some, that was the end. For others, it was only the beginning of a deeper kind of grief. And still, the silence lived on. It lived in the unanswered phones, in the emails that would never be opened, in the empty airports and the paused conversations. It lived in the stories left unfinished, in the children who would grow up with only fading photos, in the parents who woke up every day wondering if maybe, just maybe, this would be the day they'd know. Because knowledge, real knowledge, was all they had left to hope for. In the next chapter, we'll turn from the human to the technical, exploring the search itself, the technologies used, the scope of the effort, and the strange terrain of the ocean floor that swallowed a plane whole. For now, let your mind rest. Let the silence stretch, not in fear, but in reverence. For the lives remembered, for the questions still unfolding. Chapter 10. Beneath the surface. To search for something lost in the sky is difficult, but to search for something that vanished into the sea, deep, cold, and constantly moving, is something else entirely. When MH370 disappeared, there was no blueprint for what would come next. No search in aviation history had required so much time, so much ocean, or so much uncertainty. The ocean is not like the sky. It is not mapped by satellites in real time. It does not echo back a clean signal. It conceals, swallows, transforms. What crashes into it doesn't remain where it fell. It drifts, breaks apart, settles, and disappears. Yet, in the days after March 8, 2014, a search began. First above water, planes, helicopters, and ships combed the South China Sea. Then the Strait of Malacca. When the radar data changed the path and the Inmarsat satellite data pointed south, the entire mission shifted. The Indian Ocean became the focus. Not the northern arc through Central Asia, ruled out based on lack of radar returns, but the southern arc toward nothing. There were no flight corridors there, no islands, no destinations, just water. From the coast of Western Australia, the search began in earnest. Governments, including Malaysia, China, and Australia, committed resources. Experts from Boeing, Inmarsat, and international agencies came together. A high-tech operation unfolded on a low-tech backdrop. Waves, wind, weather, and uncertainty. At first, they searched the surface. They used drift models, calculations based on where floating wreckage might end up, to narrow down the possible impact zone. Planes scanned from the sky, ships scanned from the sea. They followed leads from satellite images, suspicious shapes, shadows on water. But every lead turned up nothing. Not a life raft, not a floating seat, not even luggage. It was strange. Most plane crashes in water produce floating debris, wreckage, oil slicks, something. MH370 left behind only silence. So after weeks, the search turned downward. Sonar was the next tool. Using advanced towed systems often pulled behind search vessels for hundreds of kilometers, analysts began scanning the ocean floor. The aim was to find a signature. Something large, metallic, out of place. A shape that did not belong to nature. The problem was the terrain. This part of the Indian Ocean, known as the Broken Ridge, is not flat. It's a world of underwater mountains, deep ravines, and shifting silt. Few maps existed of the seabed at this depth. So before they could search, they had to map. Mapping the ocean floor is slow. It takes months. Using multi-beam sonar, ships crawled through sections of the target zone, building three-dimensional images grid by grid. This became the bathymetric survey. Only after that could the actual search begin. For this, they used two main types of technology: towed sonar vehicles and autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs. These machines scanned for anomalies, bouncing sound off the ocean floor, translating echoes into digital shapes. It was delicate work. A misreading could mean mistaking a rock formation for fuselage. A technical failure could erase hours of data. Every target needed to be examined and rescanned. Search vessels worked for months at a time. Crews rotated. Equipment broke and was repaired. Progress was made in long, silent corridors of deep time. And still nothing. It was, by all measures, one of the most extensive underwater searches ever undertaken. By early 2017, over 120,000 square kilometers had been covered. Dozens of possible targets had been investigated, but not a single confirmed part of MH370 was found in the search zone. Only outside of it, on distant beaches, did the plane reveal itself. In 2015, the Flaperon washed up on Réunion Island. Then, more debris was found on the coasts of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Madagascar. Small pieces, parts of the wing, interior panels, fragments of the engine housing. Each item told its own story. Some showed signs of prolonged exposure. Others, barnacle growth. Some appeared to have been in the water from the start. Others, perhaps dislodged later. None could be precisely dated to a crash site, but they supported the satellite data. The pieces had drifted westward consistent with a crash in the southern Indian Ocean. That should have narrowed the search. And yet, the search zone, based on those same calculations, remained barren. By early 2018, the search was officially called off. A private company, Ocean Infinity, conducted one final effort. Using a fleet of high-tech AUVs, they scanned even more territory. Their mission was fast, efficient, cutting-edge. It also came up empty. No fuselage, no cockpit, no black boxes, only the deep. Experts debated what went wrong. Was the impact zone miscalculated? Did the plane glide farther than expected? Could the satellite data have been flawed? One scenario was that the aircraft was uncontrolled at the end, spiraling quickly into the sea. Another suggested a controlled descent. Someone at the controls until the final seconds, guiding the plane into the water deliberately. Each possibility had its advocates. Each was based on simulations, data modeling, and educated guesses. But there was no evidence, just theories. Meanwhile, the seabed revealed other things. Shipwrecks from centuries past. Geological formations never before seen. Ghosts from other eras resting untouched beneath kilometers of pressure and darkness. MH370 was not among them. For the families, the failure to find the wreck was devastating. Without it, there could be no recovery of remains. No black box recordings. No final answers. But it also became something else, a symbol. A reminder that, even in the age of satellites, smartphones, and instant communication, mystery still exists. That nature still holds its secrets. That even something as large as a 777 can vanish into the blue and leave only whispers. For some, that was a comfort. A poetic silence. For others, it was unbearable. The search may resume one day. With better technology. With new data. With the right drift model, the right sonar return, the right moment. Until then, the Indian Ocean holds its truth. In the next chapter, we'll explore what came next, the investigations, the conclusions, the unresolved questions that continue to ripple outward like sound waves in deep water. Let your thoughts drift again now, like the wreckage might have, through time, through silence, into the cold, unknowing blue. Chapter 11, The Official Story. By 2018, 4 years had passed since MH370 disappeared. 4 years of search missions, international cooperation, independent analyses, and endless speculation. The world had watched and waited. The families had endured. And now, at last, the time had come for answers. On July 30th, 2018, Malaysia released the final report. It was over 400 pages long, dense, technical, meticulous. A document built from radar data, satellite signals, witness interviews, maintenance records, and every fragment of evidence available. It was supposed to bring closure. But instead, it left the same lingering sense that had haunted this story from the start. Too much is missing. The official title of the document was Matter of Fact, Safety Investigation Report, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. It followed international protocols aligned with ICAO guidelines and sought to determine, not blame, but cause. And right from the beginning, the investigators made something clear: they still did not know where the plane was. They laid out what they could confirm. MH370 had taken off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. local time. The flight had been normal. Communications routine. Weather clear. The Boeing 777 was in good condition. Pilots were experienced. At 1:19 a.m., the final words from the cockpit, "Good night, Malaysian 370." And then, minutes later, the transponder was turned off. The plane deviated from its path, turning sharply to the west. Military radar tracked it crossing back over Malaysia, then north of Sumatra. Then gone. The final handshake from the Inmarsat satellite system came hours later over the Indian Ocean. It was not a normal flight path, not a navigational error. It was deliberate. The report acknowledged this. Someone had turned off the transponder. Someone had changed the route. The autopilot had likely been reprogrammed. But who and why? On this, the report gave no conclusion. It considered the flight crew. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farrokh Abdul Hamid were both experienced with no major issues in their records. They had passed recent evaluations. Psychologically stable. No signs of stress or financial problems. The report noted that the captain had a home simulator and had flown routes similar to the suspected MH370 path. But that wasn't proof. The data could not prove intent. It could not link the simulator exercises to any crime. There was no manifesto, no suicide note, no credible motive. So the investigators stated what they could and what they couldn't. They could not rule out the possibility that unlawful interference had occurred, nor could they prove it. The same went for mechanical failure. There was no evidence of a technical issue, no mayday, no signs of smoke or fire, but without wreckage or black boxes, it could not be ruled out entirely. It was a report of maybes. Even the satellite data, the cornerstone of the search, came with caveats. The Inmarsat pings were real, but their interpretation involved assumptions about the speed of the plane, its descent angle, even its fuel burn. Each variable introduced uncertainty. And so the final verdict was no verdict. The investigators wrote, "The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance of MH370. In effect, it was an official acknowledgement of mystery. The media covered the report widely. Some emphasized the lack of answers. Others pointed to the possibility of pilot involvement. A few saw confirmation of their theories. But for the families of the passengers and crew, it was another hollow moment. For years, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of hours of search, and no conclusion. Many felt abandoned, others angry, some simply tired. The Malaysian government, for its part, said the search could resume if credible new evidence emerged. But none did. And so, with the release of the report, the investigation entered a kind of suspended animation. But not all was still. Independent researchers continued to dig. Scientists refined drift models, trying to trace debris paths backward. Engineers reviewed radar data, searching for new interpretations. Former investigators gave interviews, sometimes suggesting what they could not say officially. Some hinted that the cause may have been known all along, but could not be proven. Others believed something critical was still missing. Was it possible, they asked, that certain radar data had never been released? Could there have been political sensitivities, military zones, classified capabilities that prevented full transparency? Or was it simply that the ocean had one? In the absence of answers, people returned to their own conclusions. To some, it was a tragic accident, an onboard fire, a sudden decompression, a failed attempt to turn back. To others, it was a hijacking, a rogue pilot or crew member slowly taking the plane off course for reasons unknown. Still others believed in deeper conspiracies, state secrets, military cover-ups, experimental technology. And through all of it, the official report sat like a stone at the bottom of the sea. Heavy, quiet, final yet unresolved. It was perhaps the best that could be done without the plane. And so MH370 joined a rare category, unexplained. Like Amelia Earhart, like the USS Cyclops, like the aircraft that vanish and are never found. But it also stood apart because this was the 21st century. This was not a time of radio silence and paper maps. This was a time of satellites, surveillance, and global tracking. And yet, even in this era, the sky had opened its arms and taken a plane without leaving answers behind. In the next chapter, we'll explore the alternative theories, the possibilities that didn't make it into the official report but lived on in the public mind. The quiet speculation that shadows every mystery when the facts run dry. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts float. The search for truth continues, not always forward, not always down, but inward. Toward understanding. Toward peace. Even in the absence of proof. Chapter 12, The Shadow Theories. When the official story fails to close the door, other voices enter. Some come in softly, born of curiosity. Others arrive more forcefully, carried by suspicion, fear, or grief. In the absence of hard answers, theories grow like vines, stretching into the unknown, looking for something to hold. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, despite all its analysis, searches, and reports, left a vacuum. And vacuums, by their nature, do not remain empty for long. Across forums, in documentaries, inside long articles and short interviews, people began to speculate. Some were aviation experts with technical insights. Others were outsiders trying to make sense of a mystery too large to ignore. Many theories echoed what investigators had already considered. But others strayed into darker territory where fact and possibility blur into something harder to define. One of the most persistent theories was that of pilot suicide. The idea wasn't new. In 1999, Egyptair Flight 990 had crashed under circumstances linked to cockpit control. In 2013, LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 descended into the ground in what was later deemed a deliberate act by the captain. Could MH370 be the same? Proponents of this theory pointed to Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah. They noted that he had flown a simulated path on his home computer that roughly mirrored the flight's suspected path into the southern Indian Ocean. They cited his personal life, suggesting, with limited evidence, that he may have been isolated, troubled, or politically disillusioned. They imagined a scenario, a controlled, calculated act. The captain waits until the co-pilot leaves the cockpit. He locks the door, disables communications, changes the course, flies into darkness. The plane becomes a tomb in the sky, silent, unannounced, drifting to the edge of the world. But critics of this theory point out that there is no motive, no confession, no warning signs. Zahari left no message. His colleagues described him as dedicated and thoughtful, and even the home flight simulator data was inconclusive. In the end, it remains a possibility, not proof. Another theory explored the idea of hijacking, but not the kind that ends in demands or threats. This was more complex, a covert operation, a hidden hand. Some suggested that the plane had been seized by someone on board, perhaps a passenger with technical knowledge. They imagined a plan that involved disabling communications, navigating toward an undisclosed location, and landing somewhere remote. Supporters of this idea often pointed to the Northern Arc, the part of the Inmarsat satellite data that could have led the plane towards Central Asia, not the Indian Ocean. Could the military radars in those regions have simply not revealed what they saw? Others focused on cargo. MH370 was carrying 10,000 kilograms of cargo, including 2,500 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries. Some questioned whether these could have overheated or sparked a fire. Was there a sudden emergency? A crew struggling to contain something? Could the plane have become disabled, flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel? But again, no distress call. No wreckage in areas consistent with that kind of emergency. Then there were the geopolitical theories. These strayed further from known data. Some claimed the plane was accidentally shot down, perhaps by a military operation gone wrong. They drew parallels to Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, or more recently, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was downed over Ukraine just 4 months after MH370 vanished. Could MH370 have entered restricted airspace? Was it mistaken for a threat? The absence of wreckage fed these thoughts. If a nation had made a mistake, would they admit it? Or would they cover it up, allowing the mystery to endure as the quieter alternative? No evidence supported this directly, but the lack of evidence against it kept it alive. Other theories drifted further from logic. Some believed the plane had been abducted either by secret technology, experimental weapons, or, in rare cases, non-human intelligence. These theories often pointed to the suddenness of the disappearance, the lack of debris, the failure to track such a massive object. It is human to reach for patterns in the chaos, to sense intention where randomness may rule, to ask, how could a plane vanish so completely without someone helping it along? These theories, while often speculative or unfounded, spoke to something deeper, a need to feel that even a terrible truth is better than a blank one. And behind all of these ideas was a persistent suspicion that perhaps we had not been told everything. Investigators, while diligent, were limited. Some data came late. Some radar records were never released in full. Some interviews remained classified. The cockpit recordings, only the final minutes before loss of contact, left more questions than answers. What happened in the cockpit? Why were no distress calls made? Why was the flight path changed with such precision? And what kind of person or force could orchestrate such an act and vanish without a trace? The world had seen mysteries before, but rarely one so large, so modern, so global. And yet, it was not the strangeness of MH370 that gave rise to theories. It was the emptiness, the lack of closure, the unanswered questions that hung in the sky long after the flight itself had gone. As weeks became months and months became years, the theories became part of the narrative. Not distractions, but reflections of grief, of wonder, of frustration. For some, they were a form of protest. For others, a method of comfort. Each theory was a shadow of a missing fact. Each question a way of keeping the story alive. In the next chapter, we'll return to the families, the ones who waited, who searched, who grieved, and who still, even now, hold onto hope. We'll step away from satellites and theories and look into the human heart of the mystery, where silence is not the end, but the beginning of something else. Chapter 13, Those Left Behind. In the gentle glow of dawn on March 8, 2014, while the world above was waking, a different kind of morning was breaking for the families of Flight 370. Their journeys of grief began not with a sudden crash or a public event, but with absence, an absence that stretched into weeks, then months, then years. They knew enough to be certain something terrible had happened, but not enough to know what or why. And so their lives took on a quiet, unrelenting rhythm of waiting. For the next of kin, parents, spouses, children, siblings, every day became measured not by calendars but by fragments of news. A briefing here, a statement there, a downed lead, a hopeful glimmer. Each update bore the weight of possibility, and each delay the heaviness of doubt. They watched governments convene, experts debate, search vessels trawl the ocean, yet still the answers did not come. In Beijing, relatives formed organizations to support one another, sharing both information and solace. They gathered on sidewalks outside diplomatic offices, clutching photographs of loved ones, softly chanting names. Volunteers handed out leaflets, profiles of missing passengers, flight details, contact sheets, hoping someone, somewhere, might recognize a face or a story and spark a clue. But most days ended with empty hands. In Kuala Lumpur, families confronted the frustration of international politics. They navigated embassies, consulates, and airline offices, often encountering bureaucratic barriers and conflicting messages. The Malaysian government issued statements of condolence, promising full assistance, yet the pace of investigation felt slow, the communication fragmented. A broken trust grew as each press conference seemed to offer less clarity than the one before. It was not only the physical distance that weighed on them, but the distance of understanding. Friends and neighbors, while sympathetic, could not fathom waiting for proof of tragedy. The world would move on, life judged by resume, by meetings, by daily tasks. Yet for these families, every moment held the echo of a vanished person. One mother in Penang spoke of the emptiness each night when she turned off the lights in her son's room. His belongings remained as they had been packed, as though he might return at any moment to fold his clothes and lift his suitcase. Each morning, she returned to the same single bed, hollow and still, and wondered how you live suspended between hope and heartbreak. Children lost parents they would never know. A daughter who had been 2 years old discovered photographs of her smiling mother in a frame, then asked why she never came back to tuck her in. A 10-year-old son in Australia wrote letters that went unanswered, addressed to his father's seat number, taped to the front door in hopes of a reply. Each question was a prayer for return. Spouses, married only months before, awoke to bedrooms empty of their partners. They clung to messages left in the hours before departure, sweet texts wishing safe travels, a selfie with the boarding pass. These became relics, reminders of love and sudden loss. Some kept wedding rings hidden in pockets as though they might slip them on and reverse the day. Amid grief, they found community. In hotel lobbies, families met daily, sharing news, frustration, fear. They wept together as government officials offered their condolences. They laughed sometimes, too, at memories of happier times, a husband's joke, a mother's recipe, a daughter's painting. These moments of light were brief notes of comfort in a symphony of silence. Volunteers, none related to those lost, came alongside, offering translation, legal advice, psychological support. Aid groups set up hotlines. Psychologists flew in to counsel traumatized relatives. They spoke of ambiguous loss, a term from grief theory describing loss without closure. It is harder, they said, than death itself. In death, at least you have a body. Here, you had neither body nor explanation. Relatives traveled great distances for updates. They flew from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, Melbourne to Kuala Lumpur, Singapore to Perth. Each trip was an echo of the lost voyage. Each airport terminal a bitter reminder. They slept in unfamiliar beds with unfamiliar bedsheets, but dreamt of familiar lives returned. Their activism shaped new policies. In some nations, regulations changed to require more robust tracking of aircraft, real-time streaming of cockpit data, and automatic underwater locator beacons. They lobbied parliamentarians, joined international aviation committees, and testified before inquiries. Their plight became a catalyst for reform, an unexpected legacy born of tragedy. Yet every victory carried its own ache. Each new rule was a testament to what had already been lost. A brighter future, but only forged in memory of vanished lives. On social media, memorial pages kept their stories alive. Families posted photos, messages, birthday tributes. Strangers from around the world sent well wishes, small tokens of solidarity, digital candles, online vigils, hashtags that trended briefly before fading. These virtual embraces offered fleeting warmth, but they could not fill an empty seat at the dinner table. In quieter moments, some turned inward. They wrote journals. They took up causes in memory of their loved ones, a scholarship fund, a charity for aviation safety, a foundation for missing person cases. They channeled their sorrow into purpose, hoping to spare others the same enduring uncertainty. Yet underlying every action was the same question: when will we know? For some, the answer was final, a deep-sea tomb with no survivors. For others, the idea that their relative might have lived somewhere unknown offered a glimmer of hope too powerful to extinguish. They imagined secret islands, covert airstrips, hidden rescue operations, stories born of desperation more than logic. These visions kept them calling embassies late at night, scanning obscure flight tracker apps, writing letters to governments and private investigators alike. In 2018, when the official search was suspended, the relatives gathered in silent protest. In Kuala Lumpur, they carried placards reading, "Don't give up," and 239 voices, one cry for justice. Their faces, lined with grief and resolve, faced the cameras, and the cameras could only watch. They made a pact to never let Flight 370 be forgotten. They would turn their grief into a reminder of vulnerability in modern life, that even the most advanced technologies can fail, and even collective mourning can't fill every void. And so, those left behind became the memory keepers. They kept vigil at memorial sites. They updated websites with new drift model findings. They celebrated anniversaries with candlelight ceremonies. They remained the steady pulse of remembrance when news cycles moved on. In their own way, they charted the only path left, to keep their loved ones alive in mind and voice. Each story they told became part of a larger narrative, weaving together loss and persistence, silence and memory. They carried forward not only pain, but also love. An insistence that 239 individuals, each with a name and a life, be remembered not as a flight number, but as a mosaic of human stories. As you reflect on their journey, consider this: tragedy can take what we hold most dear, but it cannot take from us how we remember. In the vastness of oceans and the silence of skies, those left behind continue to call out, so that one day, perhaps, their echoes will guide us toward the truth. In the final chapter, we will gather these threads: the flight's technical mysteries, the ocean's silent depths, the family stories, and the theories both official and shadowed, and ask what MH370 means for our world. How does a modern disappearance reshape our understanding of safety, technology, and the fragility of life? And how, in the end, do we move forward when the answers remain just out of reach? Rest now, with the knowledge that memory endures where wreckage cannot be found. The story is not over because as long as we remember, the vanished remain present.